Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of our Chapter 11 lecture series. This section is entitled The Old South. The focus question for this section is, how did slavery shape the social relations in the Old South? The majority of white Southerners were what famous Southern historian Frank Owsley described as the plain folk of the Old South. The majority of white Southerners did not own slaves. Most were white small farmers, lived in hilly areas that were unsuitable for cotton production using family labor. Most of these white families produced crops and livestock for their own family's consumption. Very little for the outside market, if any at all. Now, although they resented the planter class's power, they believed their economic and personal freedom also rested on the institution of slavery. Slavery for whites provided a common racial identity. It also provided business ties. There were also kinship ties between the planter class and the plain folk of the Old South. And of course, they shared a common political culture as well, in which slavery provided the foundation for that political culture. The existence of slavery and the dehumanization of blacks due to the institution of slavery allowed whites, regardless of economic status, to inhabit a superior social status despite any class or economic hardships. As mentioned in the previous slide, the vast majority of white Southerners did not own any slaves at all. Roughly only about 5 to 10% of the Southern white population owned any slaves, and roughly 1 to 2% owned more than a handful and would be considered part of the elite planter class. Now, this planter class was small, but they owned the vast majority of the slaves in the region and held most of the most fertile lands of the South as well. The economic power of the planter class, due to the profits from cotton production, translated directly into social and political power. Planters and the plantation economy dominated Southern society, Southern culture, and Southern politics. Poor whites actually looked up to the planters and hoped to emulate their success. Another reason why, in general, the poor white population supported the institution of slavery. They too hoped to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if you will. The classic rags to riches tale, that if they could acquire a little bit of land and a few slaves, they could translate that into a cotton empire, and they too could ascend into the elite planter class. At least that was the American dream for many poor white Southerners. The question of morality in regards to the institution of slavery always rested just below the surface of any discussion of slavery. Now, to combat these moral questions, Southern slaveholders developed what has been known as the Paternalist Ethos. Their values glorified paternalism, which is defined as a hierarchical agrarian society in which slaveholding gentlemen took personal responsibility for the physical and moral well-being of their dependents, women, children, and their slaves. It was, according to this ethos, the responsibility of the slaveholder to take care of their slaves, to make sure that they had all the necessities of life and were instructed in proper civilization according to the Southern ethos. Now, this concept masked and justified the brutal reality of slavery. Most owners viewed themselves as kind and respectable through this paternalist lens, even while they bought, sold, and punished their slaves. This paternalist ethos was very much wrapped up alongside this idea of a Southern code of honor, which really provided the basis for the relations between white males in the South during the antebellum period. Southern whites adhered to a code of personal honor defended with violence, including dueling, which was technically illegal, but that didn't stop Southern white males from participating in this sort of interaction. To Southern white males, reputation was everything. Slights and insults were taken very seriously as they threatened the social position that white males held within Southern society. White Southern women, for their part, were very much confined within the domestic circle. And this was another expression of the paternalist ethos and the Southern code of honor. Southern white women were very much placed on a pedestal, and the protection of women was a point of honor for men in the South. Women were expected to be virtuous, chaste, and obedient. Confinement to that domestic sphere for women was even more pronounced in the South as it was in the North, as in the South there was not the sort of safety valves, if you will, that allowed women to look outside the home for work in mills or factories or domestic labor, things like that, that were available to some women of the North to at least in part escape that domestic sphere to a degree. As the first half of the 19th century progressed, and abolitionist sentiment and rhetoric increased in the North, in response, an equally vociferous pro-slavery argument developed in the South to counter abolitionist rhetoric from the North, which is a subject that we'll get to in depth in later lectures. This pro-slavery argument in the South reflected a deep commitment to white supremacy in the region. For some, they found legitimization for slavery in biblical passages defending the ancient form of the institution. The others claimed that slavery was essential for human progress, that without slaves to do the hard labor that average people were reluctant to do, progress would not be possible. Many insisted that slavery guaranteed equality for whites. It prevented the development of a dependent white working class as existed in the North, and allowed Southern whites economic autonomy and independence, something that was relatively diminishing in the North as that economy was quickly industrializing and increasingly commercializing. Also, paternalistic arguments in the South claimed that slavery was actually good for African Americans. African Americans were seen as like children that needed protection and discipline. Slavery provided them with civilization and a pathway out of barbarism, which was the natural state of African societies as was seen through the lens of the Western pro-slavery argument. Beginning in the 1830s, the pro-slavery argument from the South really took off as Southern whites and politicians came to defend slavery as the foundation of a hierarchical society. They argued that freedom and equality were not necessarily universal entitlements, even for all whites. They viewed hierarchies as necessary to ensure a well-functioning and well-ordered society. Competition, individualism, and egalitarianism of the North encouraged social and political strife. They viewed inequality as a fundamental law of human existence, that hierarchies had always existed and that they would always exist. And not only that, but they were essential for human society itself. The majority of white Southerners came to believe that freedom for whites rested on the power to command the labor of blacks. To them, wage labor was just the enslavement of whites into a dependent status. Alright gang, that concludes part 2 of our Chapter 11 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.